Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, Happy New Year. I hope you have a wonderful year ahead, you and your families. We are delighted to start the year with Governor Chris Waller, and in one of our lectures of the governor. Remember, these lectures of the governor, the idea is exactly to have governors of central banks and members of the monetary boards talking about not only monetary policy, but basically issues regarding policy making that affects everyone. And I think we can start in a better way with Governor Waller because of his extensive experience, not only as an academic, as a policymaker, but also as a public speaker. And you'll understand when he gives his lecture how much we appreciate him when he comes over to the OECD. He works in our WP3, but also, as I said, throughout the years has had significant research on many of the areas that we follow at the OECD. So Governor Waller took office as the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in December 2020. Before that, he was serving as Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. In addition to his experience at the Federal Reserve System, he served as professor and Gilbert Schaefer Chair of Economics at the University of Notre Dame, and also a research fellow at Notre Dame's Kellogg Institute for International Studies. Before that, he was a professor and chair of macroeconomics and monetary economics at the University of Kentucky. And during that time, he was also a research fellow at the Center for European Integration Studies at the University of Bonn. And from 92 to 94, he served as a director of graduate studies at Indiana's University Department of Economics. And as you can see, he has published extensively in many of these fields, and he has been a very prominent speaker in many of these fields. So without further ado, we look forward to hearing your intervention, Governor, so please go ahead.
All right, thank you, Alvaro. Thank you for the honor of initiating this new series of lectures from central banking. Always got to turn on the mic. That always helps. I'll start over. So thank you, and thank you for the honor of initiating this new series of lectures from central bankers. I'll begin with a few words on the U.S. economic outlook and the implications for U.S. monetary policy. But on this occasion, I thought it would appropriate to then widen my perspective to address what I see as the leading challenges that OECD economies face that are of particular importance to central bankers in how we approach monetary policy and our other responsibilities. So looking at the U.S., I continue to believe that the U.S. economy is on a solid footing. Real gross domestic product, GDP, growth has been above 2% for 8 of the last 9 quarters and is expected to grow above 2% in the fourth quarter of 2024. Despite this robust economic growth, the labor market softened over 2024, and employment is now near what I judge to be the Federal Open Market Committee's, or FOMC's, maximum employment objective. I have seen nothing in the data or forecasts that suggest the labor market will dramatically weaken over coming months. With regard to inflation, after a period of rapid disinflation in 2022 and 2023, progress appears to have stalled in the final months of 2024. Our latest reading of core personal consumption expenditures, or PCE inflation, is 2.8% for the 12 months ending in November. This is down just a bit from where it was a year earlier at 3.2%. This minimal further progress has led to calls to stop or slow reducing the policy rate. However, I believe that inflation will continue to make progress toward our 2% goal over the medium term, and that further reductions in the policy rate will be appropriate. Now let me explain why I expect inflation to continue toward our goal. First, as we saw a year ago when inflation briefly increased, progress has been uneven. But disinflation is more apparent if one smooths through the recent upticks. To tease out the underlying trend in inflation, I often look at the 6-month percentage change in core PC prices, which is running at 2.4% at an annual rate for November, and has mostly been moving down toward 2% over the course of the year. Second, the monthly reading for November came in much lower than expected at 0.11%, after rising 0.26% in October. Third, inflation in 2024 has largely been driven by increases in imputed prices, such as housing services and non-market services, which are estimated rather than directly observed, and I consider a less reliable guide to the balance of supply and demand across all goods and services in the economy. Now, these two categories represent about 1/3 of the core PC basket of goods. So if you look at the prices associated with the other 2/3 of that market basket, they on average increased less than 2% over the past 12 months through November. Now, I don't support ignoring our best estimates of prices for housing and non-market services, but I want to point out that I find it notable that imputed prices, rather than actual observed prices, were driving inflation in 2024, and thus expectations of the policy rate path. Finally, the higher inflation readings from early in 2024 will begin to drop out of inflation numbers beginning in January. This should result in a significant step down in the 12-month inflation numbers as we go into March. Now, looking further forward, geopolitical conflict could boost prices as it has at times in the past. In addition, tariff proposals raise the possibility that a new source of upward pressure on inflation could emerge in the coming year. Projections of the economic impact of these possible policy changes vary widely. But if, as I expect, tariffs do not have a significant or persistent effect on inflation, therefore they are unlikely to affect my view of the appropriate path for monetary policy. Now, of course, we need to see what policies are enacted before we seriously consider their effects. So what is my view? If the outlook evolves as I have described here, I will support continuing to cut our policy rate in 2025. The pace of those cuts will depend on how much progress we make on inflation, while keeping the labor market from weakening. Now, based on the most recent summary of economic projections, the median of policymakers' expected appropriate policy rate this year implies 2 more 25 basis point cuts. But the range of views on the FOMC on this is quite large, with some participants advocating for no cuts and some as many as 5 cuts. So as always, the extent of further easing will depend on what the data tell us about progress towards 2% inflation, but my bottom line message is that I believe more cuts will be appropriate. So now let me turn to what I consider some of the leading challenges that will frame monetary policy actions for OECD members in 2025 and beyond. Each of the issues I raise are sizable challenges for all OECD countries, but some are bigger challenges in some places than others. I have not tried to rank these challenges in importance, so please don't take any signal from the order in which I talk about them. I will start with the ongoing challenge all central banks face in reaching our targets for inflation. While 12-month measures of headline inflation are close to target in most jurisdictions, most central banks target inflation in the medium term, and indicators of the trajectory of future price changes, such as core inflation, are still running persistently above target. Like the Federal Reserve, most central banks in OECD countries are gradually easing monetary policy as inflation falls. I believe policy is still restrictive in most cases, which should support the goals of policymakers to have inflation at their targets going forward. Now, this common challenge in the month ahead has its roots, as we all know, in the common experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. Economic conditions before and during the pandemic varied widely across OECD countries, as did the focus, timing, and forcefulness of policy responses. The surge in inflation during the pandemic was a result of both supply and demand factors. And while the timing of the inflation surge varied across countries, the COVID inflation was a largely global phenomenon, as shown by research conducted by Federal Reserve research staff. A common factor that drove inflation across our economies was the disruption of goods production and delivery. Shortages of key components and waves of COVID variants repeatedly disrupted supply chains, causing inflation to persist. Fortunately, these disruptions have receded, and delivery times have returned to pre-pandemic levels. That said, there are many geopolitical factors that are still keeping deliveries of supplies volatile, which potentially could affect economic activity and inflation. Now, another common experience has been the fiscal response to the pandemic. Now, the extent to which fiscal policies rolled out in support of households and businesses during the pandemic contributed to inflation is the subject of ongoing debate. But regardless of the effects on inflation, fiscal policy actions across OECD countries led to a doubling and tripling of budget deficits as a percentage of GDP, with even larger percentages in some places. Those deficits have steadily fallen since, but are still higher in many countries than before the pandemic, and the debt levels have grown for many OECD countries. Now, another recent challenge for OECD economies is the widespread weakness in manufacturing. Manufacturing boomed in many places with the onset of the pandemic, when consumers switched their spending from in-person services to goods. But as businesses and economies reopened with the easing of pandemic-related restrictions, the swing to service spending by consumers began what has been a sustained slide in manufacturing in OECD economies. This slide has been compounded by three other factors. First, because manufacturing is capital intensive, interest rate increases over the past couple of years raised capital costs in this sector. As monetary policy eases across countries, this effect may unwind. Also, higher energy costs after Russia's attack on Ukraine have hurt manufacturing more than other sectors. And lastly, China's push to reduce its reliance on imports and expand its global share in sectors such as autos has had a big impact across OECD countries. While the manufacturing sector is a smaller share of economic activity in the United States than in some OECD countries, we shall see whether the weakness in global manufacturing is affected by the prospect of changes in trade policy in the U.S. and elsewhere. Now, the extent and timing of tariffs are highly uncertain, as are the effects. Overall, the evolution of manufacturing adds uncertainty to the forecast of central bankers' outlooks. A short to medium-term challenge that is and will remain widespread among OECD countries is geopolitical risk. Indices of geopolitical risk suggest that risks are elevated, but not nearly as high as they were when Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. Now, shockingly, today, you certainly can't see much evidence for geopolitical risk affecting financial markets. They're about as frothy as they can be in the U.S. But geopolitical risk will nevertheless remain a challenge that central bankers will need to keep in mind. The outbreak of war in Europe and more recently in the Middle East were shocking developments that continue to reverberate, as we have seen recently in Syria. It is unclear how these events will ultimately affect security, trade, and migration flows around the world. The fact that these conflicts have not affected the global economy to a greater extent than they have so far doesn't mean they won't and can't. Research shows that higher levels of political risk and economic uncertainty more broadly tend to foreshadow lower investment and employment. I expect that central bankers in OECD economies will continue to consider geopolitical risk in the medium term. Now, the next challenge for central bankers that I would like to address also has shorter and long-term dimensions to it. And that is something that I will refer to as a rethink of globalization. For close to a decade now, many countries have been re-examining the cost and benefits from steadily freer global movement in capital, labor, and goods. That was the norm over previous decades. Although global trade has not decreased in the last decade, although it has not decreased in the last decade, we have clearly seen changes in trade patterns, with more countries and firms putting greater emphasis on rerouting trade flows and shortening supply chains to avoid geopolitical risk and tariffs. Now, this isn't simply the result of some failed ministerial meeting or bilateral conflict. Rather, it has been a persistent and widespread trend that has been underway for some time. The presumption that the increasingly tighter global integration of our economies and financial markets would inevitably continue is no longer as safe as it long was. Now, at the same time, I have refrained from calling this development, as some have, the end of globalization, because I don't believe this will be the outcome. As I think about the 38 governments represented by the OECD and consider how this organization has grown in size and in the depth of its engagement on different issues, I would say that globalization is not going away. What I do expect, however, is that there will be more thought and consideration among our leaders for how globalization affects the people we serve, with a more careful weighing of both the potential cost of close integration and potential benefits. As these decisions by governments are made, central bankers will need to be prepared to respond appropriately in setting monetary policy and promoting financial stability. Drink of water here. Now, another longer-term challenge involves demographic trends. What I mean here is the aging of populations in OECD countries, and to some extent everywhere else. Now, while I view this mainly as a problem for fiscal authorities, it does have some ramifications for central bankers in terms of long-run growth rates, productivity, and asset prices. In the United States, those between the ages of 16 and 54 were 72% of the population in 2003. It fell to 62.7% in 2023 and are now projected to be 61% in 2033. Aging is happening even more quickly in some other OECD countries. Now, this is a slow-moving development, but as populations age and move from working to retirement, employment and economic output will fall. This by itself lowers per capita GDP, which can affect consumption, investment, and inflation. As aging populations sell accumulated assets to support retirement consumption, asset prices and interest rates will adjust as well, with the latter potentially affecting the central bank's estimate of the neutral policy rate. Now, there are mitigants to soften the effect of aging populations, such as an increase in retirement age, immigration, and higher productivity growth for younger workers. Again, these demographic factors are more important for fiscal policy, but there are spillovers to monetary policy. Now, productivity growth is another issue facing central bankers, and I know has been a subject of conversations at the OECD gatherings this year. According to one set of estimates, labor productivity growth is responsible for more than half of the cumulated GDP growth in the United States since the end of 2019, compared to much smaller shares in other countries. Now, productivity growth is notoriously volatile, and even years later, it's hard to say exactly what technological or other factors caused it to happen. Having some understanding of the trajectory of productivity growth is helpful for policymakers thinking about how fast their economies can grow without inducing inflation. Central bankers must keep their eyes on productivity in judging whether wages can grow quickly without igniting inflation, or whether potential growth has increased. Productivity growth also plays a role in assessing the real neutral policy rate, otherwise known as R star. Now, higher productivity growth is often associated with a higher value of R star for some policymakers, and thus would have implications for the interpretation of the degree of monetary accommodation or restrictiveness for policy. One way to try to understand some of the factors affecting productivity is to compare the United States to other OECD countries. While it's not particularly new for productivity to grow faster in the US than in other advanced economies, some differences in our economies may have been particularly salient during and after the pandemic. First, there was more disruption in employment in the United States during COVID than in many other OECD countries. And after the pandemic subsided, this may have led to better matching of workers with new jobs in which they could be more productive. Second, during the acute U.S. labor shortages in 2022 and 2023, I heard numerous anecdotes that firms had to invest more in worker training to raise skill levels to what was necessary for positions. In other words, they would normally have never hired certain workers for jobs, but labor shortage was so severe, they were willing to hire people who weren't skilled and then try to get their skills up. Okay. Now, this raises labor productivity with a delay, and it may have been an important factor recently. Third, business creation is, by all evidence, easier in the United States, and new firms are often more productive than existing firms. There was a surge in U.S. business creation after COVID, which could reasonably have led to a more productive reallocation of labor. And there may have been other factors I haven't touched on. But I don't think artificial intelligence or AI was one of them. AI investment will take place over many years and most likely has not done much yet to add to aggregate productivity and productive capacity. While it is possible AI could increase longer run productivity growth, that remains to be seen. But the other possible reasons, the flexibility of labor rules, ease of business entry, barriers to innovation, lower regulatory hurdles, would sound familiar to people attending the OECD discussions a decade ago. The barriers to innovative risk-taking are probably lower and the rewards higher in the United States. So while I am skeptical that AI is already making significant contributions to aggregate productivity growth, I have little doubt that it will do so in the future. AI and allied innovations in computing have the potential to bring productivity advances to high-skill, labor-intensive services akin to the way robotics transformed high-skill manufacturing. If such advances do occur, one challenge for governments will be fostering an economy in which those dislocated by such a shift can obtain new skills and find productive and meaningful employment. As ever, prudent regulation should be balanced with support for innovation that has the potential to deliver widespread improvements in living standards. But regulatory policy should not strangle innovation in its infancy. So at the end of this list of challenges, how should central banks meet them? There will always be new challenges, but the right approach to monetary policy hasn't changed, nor should it. In every case, the answer begins with sticking to our mandates and resisting the temptation to go beyond them. We must closely monitor economic and financial conditions and look in every direction and down the road for emerging risk. In keeping to our mandates, we can see that seeing all these risks clearly is hard, so we need to remain focused. We also need to be nimble. That's one thing we've learned in the last couple of years. You got to sometimes move fast and break things. as they say in Silicon Valley. And we have to be prepared to use our monetary policy tools in new ways to prepare for unprecedented challenges that present themselves. When conditions are uncertain, as they often are, we must move deliberately, but also be ready to act quickly and decisively when the situation demands it, as we did in subduing inflation. Effective monetary policy depends on clearly communicating our intentions so that the public will act on those intentions. That also requires credibility, and this is most effectively maintained when monetary policy decisions are made according to our mandates and in the longer-term interest of a healthy economy and stable financial system. Guided by these basic principles, I believe that central bankers are up to the considerable challenges of today and those they will face in the years ahead. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Governor. So we now open the floor for questions. If you're online, please raise your hand, your virtual hand. If you're here, you obviously can raise your hand. So let's open up.
Don't be shy. You're like my students when I was a teacher. Nobody wanted to ask a question.
You have the mic.
Thank you. David Cashin, I'm a Fed employee who's currently seconded to the OECD for the next couple of years. I just wanted to get your take, your thoughts on what you think might be driving the increase in long-term yields over the last few months, despite the
increase in what?
The increase in long-term rates in the U.S., despite the 100 basis point cumulative cut in short-term rates over the last few months. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that people are talking about is, one, there is still a concern that inflation may not be beaten. So it may persist longer, so there's potentially more of an inflation premium. I'm going to tell you we're going to fix that problem, so don't worry about it. The other thing that I think is getting more and more attention is the concern about fiscal deficits. I mean, we're borrowing close to $2 trillion a year at present, and if that doesn't seem to change going forward, at some point the markets are going to demand a premium or compensation to accept the risk for financing that amount of spending. So that would just mean that you see lower prices of the assets and higher yields. So that may be what's going on. That's basically what I read and some things I've warned about over the last 2 years. If we don't get fiscal deficits down, that you'll start seeing higher long-term bond yields, and that's starting to be what we're seeing.
Thank you. Any more questions in the room? We have some online, I think. Well, I can ask you a question regarding, we know one of the issues that we've been facing in many countries is that service price inflation has been stickier than goods price inflation, which doesn't seem to be an issue. How concerned are you about this, service price inflation, and how do you see it going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, oops, it keeps going off. I think to some extent, we'll see some reduction in service price inflation. Some of that is still lagged wage increases. If you look at if I recall the data correctly, services, particularly in management, higher skilled jobs, they never went up when inflation was going up. It was mainly lower skilled workers were getting big raises, but the typical management professional level, they were not seeing huge increases in their nominal wages. And that has been starting to catch up over time, and I think that's generating some persistence in services inflation, is just service wage inflation. And services, labor is the biggest input, so that labor costs are gonna drive a lot of that. But again, as that catch-up kind of finally gets to where it should be, then it'll stop, and you should see this start coming back down. That's the simplest answer I got.
More questions?
Hi, my name is Serjan Tatamir, and I'm an economist here at the OECD. I wanted to ask you about your views on tariffs. So you said they wouldn't. Your view is they would have a temporary effect on the price level, um, but in the kind of medium to long term, higher trade barriers means less trade openness, which leads to less productivity growth, which lowers potential and pushes up prices. So I was just wondering whether was that part of the your comments, or whether you had or was it just the were you just thinking more kind of short term to medium term effects of tariffs on prices?
Yeah, so we don't really know what's gonna happen. We don't know how broad-based, how big. I mean, there's a lot of tremendous uncertainty around what's gonna happen. I just have kind of based my thinking on analysis I've seen by various private sector forecasts, going through the numbers. And if you think about tariffs, if you did them all at once and never did them again, they would just be a one-time jump in the price level. You'd see a spike in inflation, and then it would kind of go away. So that's kind of what I'm thinking is likely to happen. I don't think these draconian tariffs that everybody's talking about are necessarily gonna be implemented, so, but we don't, you don't know. But I think whatever it is, at least in the near term, which is the key part of your question, I think in the near term, I am only speaking for myself, nobody else. I just don't think we're gonna see a huge impact on inflation from this, or a very long and persistent impact. But we'll just have to wait and see. But after what we just went through with very high inflation, people are always very nervous about prices now going up. They might have been able to look through them a lot easier a couple of years ago than they do now.
Last question on aging, because you mentioned that aging obviously is an issue that having society that right now people are living much older, and this has a significant implication for how the economy is operating. We're interested to know your perspective on the impact of aging on central banking and for monetary policy.
Yeah, so it keeps going off. Yeah, that was, kind of the issues I was trying to get at, is that aging is really a fiscal issue more than a monetary issue, but if it affects things like productivity growth, that's gonna affect what, say, our estimate of R star is. That's what a bunch of my colleagues think productivity growth is a big factor. If productivity growth falls, the equilibrium neutral interest rate falls, then for the same level of interest rate, there's more restrictiveness in the economy. So that's one factor that would come into play. There could also be, again, fiscal implications for dealing with aging economies or aging populations that may lead to bigger deficit spending, more debt. Again, that affects interest rates in terms of what governments have to pay to finance all this. So, those are kind of the two simplest ones. And then, just kind of thinking about, it's just because you're aging doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, I'm gonna age, I'm gonna die, I know that part, I can't do anything big about that part, but for society, there's ways you can deal with this transition from work to retirement that aren't as disruptive as if we all woke up one day and said we're all gonna retire, and then who's gonna do anything? So, there are ways that we're thinking about dealing with that problem, and most governments are.
Thank you.
We have a question online for Mr. Waller. Does he think the market rate curve has gone too far in pricing out rate cuts?
Well, like I said, we gave guidance with our December SEP, which was, I'll be honest speaking, just for myself, filling out a forecast for the coming year that you try to say is an honest projection, I shouldn't say forecast, honest projection, when I have no idea what's gonna happen with incoming policies. I mean, I know there'll be tariffs, I know there'll be some other, but the magnitudes of them, and yet on a projection, I'm putting down a number. I'm not just saying, well, it might be a little higher, it might be a little lower. They're like, put a number in. Okay, that makes things a lot harder when you have this much uncertainty. So in terms of the markets reacting to the number of rate cuts, I would just say, that's what I was trying to say. The range right now in that SAP go from members saying 0 to members saying 5. That's a huge range of what people think is an optimal policy. So it's just going to be tough for markets and tough for all of us to figure out what's going on until we start seeing some actual policies implemented.
We have a question over there.
Hi, I'm Luis Medina, Colombia's ambassador to the OECD. I'm sorry I couldn't listen to the first part of your talk. But I mean, there's this line of thought that says that the era of zero interest rates is over, and therefore we're looking forward to, again, some medium-term tightening in the Fed. What implications, I mean, does that mean that, for instance, Latin American countries are in for a rocky ride when it comes to being able to finance their debt, competing with the U.S. Interest rates? How do you see that?
Well, I mean, we went decades with interest rates nowhere near zero, and somehow we all survived. I find it amazing that we think, when I talk to my own children about buying a house, and they say, oh my God, I can't afford a house with a 6% mortgage. And I said, my first house had a 13% mortgage. What are you talking about? It's just a thing of what you're used to, and then the new reality comes along, and then I think people will adjust and they'll deal with it. But the history is not what we saw in the last decade. It is not zero. That is not what we've seen through decades of U.S. financial or any financial market. So we have to kind of think of the 2010 to 2015, 16, 18 period as being an outlier in financial market history in terms of rates being that low. And there's a lot of debate about what caused it and why it would, but I think right now it's not looking like we're going to see it return to the zero lower bound anytime soon.
Sebastian Barnes from the OECD Economics Department. Your talk has been quite forward-looking, which is what I would expect as a central banker.
Thanks.
But I was wondering, looking back, we've lived through quite an interesting period, and I don't know if there's any particular lessons you would draw from that, or things that maybe as researchers we should be thinking about. I mean, for inflation, like most people in this room, this was the first time they actually experienced inflation, anything like these rates. And as an economist, we had to sort of brush off some of our old knowledge from the sort of 70s and 80s. And it struck me that there are many things we didn't really understand about prices, for example. So about a year ago in the US, you had this quite big push from insurance, and that really reflected things that happened 2 years ago, 2 years previous, in the car repair market. But it came as a surprise to everyone, right? Because we didn't really know how the supply chains or pricing worked. So I just wondered if there's things you think we should be thinking about. So if this happens again, which it might in this more uncertain world, we're kind of better prepared to understand what might happen. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, for example, what the pandemic did, at least I'll take my perception from the U.S., was, if you had a model, you have a bunch of equations, and then you use those equations to solve for the equilibrium. The pandemic sort of took those equations and threw them all up in the air. And then they came clattering back down in a way it wasn't clear how they were all connected anymore, you couldn't rely on this one, you couldn't rely on that one. So pre-pandemic, the Phillips curve was completely flat. There was no way you could have inflation, and if you wanted to lower it, you had to have massive amounts of unemployment. And we very quickly saw that was just not true anymore. So that's where the idea that relying on what are normal, stable relationships in normal, fairly stable times, you can't necessarily rely on that when you blow the world up with a global pandemic, and you have to think very differently about things. So that would be the key thing that I would say is, in these kind of very turbulent times, sometimes your traditional relationships are not going to be a good guide to thinking about things going forward. That'd be the critical thing. Now, your point on insurance, you're just pointing out that when they're sticky prices, it takes a long time for this stuff to get passed through. So you get more persistence in inflation than if you just had one big spike and then it went away. And then that can then impact how people think about the economy, inflation, and various other things. So I would say what we saw is there is still a lot of price flexibility in the economy, but we sure saw there were a lot of sticky prices. It took a long time to adjust. Oh, and one last point. One thing I think we all learned is that you like to keep inflation low and stable. This idea that you can have, let's just run our inflation target at 4% or 5%. Nobody will care about that. Yeah, they will. Right? So low and stable inflation should be the objective for all central banks.
Amen. Questions? More? I think we have a question online.
online?
I think the person that rose their hand online can talk if they're muted. Perhaps.
We have a question from Parent Sheth. Parent, you have the floor. If not, we have a question from Christopher. Christopher, you have the floor.
Just have to unmute.
Hi. No, thank you. Just wanted to check, Governor Waller, regarding the economy and given the resilience that you talked about, how restrictive do you think Fed rates are right now? And is the continuing resilience of the economy a reason to cut fewer times next year?
Somebody mute.
That was Parent.
Chris, can you repeat your question? Who's on first?
I think it was how restrictive are interest rates right now?
Is that what that was the question? Yeah, so, there's a lot of chatter about loose financial conditions and all this, that we're really not that tight, and if we're not tight, the economy should, especially with growth rates of 3%. But when you look at the US labor market, it is not behaving or acting like an economy that is overheating or not restrictive. The labor market is, it's not booming along in the same way that people would say you would think if financial conditions were really loose. So I just think there's a little bit of a mismatch when people say, oh, financial conditions are loose, so you're not restrictive. And then when I look at the labor market looks like it's not loose in any way. The policy rates are having an effect on that. So I just think there's a little bit of a disconnect between worrying about financial conditions, which often are always driven by stock prices, and this always drives me crazy. Stock prices go up, stock prices go down. What the hell it has to do about anything with employment or productivity or anything, I'm not exactly sure. But so I don't tend to look at things with stock prices, and I'm tend to look more. The interest rates are a bigger concern, and interest rates, long-term interest rates have gone up, as somebody mentioned earlier, 100 basis points. Well, we cut 100, so that's going to have some restrictiveness. I don't know why people don't think that would be the case. So I do think they are restrictive, but not enough to throw us into a recession.
You have a question here? I think there was a question from Perrin online, but otherwise we go to Jeff.
Hi, Jeff Barnard from the Economics Department. I think you spoke about possible changes in tariffs and how, obviously there's no one knows timing and scope and so on, but your broad feeling was that the impact wasn't likely to be too large on overall price levels. But the other area, obviously, that people are thinking about is immigration and whether there's a big shift possibly to negative net immigration if there's deportations and so on. How do you see that in terms of the possible challenges that it raises for the Fed?
Yeah, again, it's not clear exactly what's going to happen and what the immigration. I would suspect that certainly comments that have been made publicly have been like, we're going to go after criminals first, or that's the first kind of for safety in that first. But I don't know exactly what the number is, but over the last 4 or 5 years, we've had something like 5 to 6 million immigrants come in. It's going to be very hard, just think, moving that many people back out of the country necessarily. So it's not even clear. There's just even debate about what's the right way to think about immigration. So it's really, that's just another area where, it's, if you thought about what it did the last few years, workers came in, GDP went up as more people worked, consumption growth went up, per capita GDP didn't really change much because more people are in the country. We didn't see it causing a lot of inflation or deflation. It did take some downward pressure off wages and vacancies. So some of that stuff could reverse if it was anywhere near the magnitude that happened. But I mean, I just have absolutely no idea what's actually going to happen.
Is there any more questions online?
we have a question here from Australia. Jason Foreman wrote recently in the Wall Street Journal in favor of monetary rules as a communication tools. Do you have a view on the usefulness of monetary policy rules?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been a long debate of following a rule to set policy, and if that's what you're gonna do literally, you can just plug it into a computer, spit out a number, and you can fire all of us. Maybe that's optimal, I don't know, but the problem is that a rule doesn't take into account things like risk management, like it just is a number, you plug in some numbers and it spits out a number. It doesn't take into account risk management. It doesn't take into account, it's only based on published data, not necessarily anecdotal data. Stuff like I heard about worker productivity training and all that, that's stuff you hear on the ground. We call it soft data. It doesn't take any of that kind of data into account. And then when it comes to rules, I can tell you right now, I've probably seen 50 to 100 rules for monetary policy in my academic life. Which one should I pick? Right? There's nothing on the 10 Commandments that says use Taylor Rule 1993 or 2 or whatever. So you have to sit down and say, what do you really want to do with a rule? I always have said, you want to use it as a rule of thumb. If I plug in the numbers and how do these rules vary and how close am I to what they kind of say, they're a good guide and a check on your own judgment. But I just think that literally applying a rule and never deviating from it is just a good way to get in trouble in general.
I think if I understand, two more questions online, one from Krishna Guha and Parim. So if they can go ahead with your questions, please, Krishna.
I can read one out online, Alvaro. Governor Waller, thank you for your interesting speech. I have a question about the recent FOMC meeting. Does the recent FOMC shift in December reflect less certainty regarding fiscal and trade policy, or is it a result of less plausible trend on inflation in Sepnov? That's from Marcin Lipka, Polish Development Bank.
Yeah, like I said, I can't speak for any of my colleagues in terms of what their thinking was. I just kind of viewed having to fill this SEP out in December as, very difficult problem. You want me to give you an accurate forecast what I think is gonna happen? I would have to have data on what's gonna happen on fiscal policy, trade, and I don't have that information. So at best, I'm kind of guessing what's gonna happen. And a lot of what I just said was, I didn't put a lot of it into my forecast. I kind of think a lot of what might actually happen is unlikely to change the path of the economy and therefore my path for policy. So I can only speak for myself. I didn't build a lot of stuff in. I'm not saying I shouldn't. I just didn't know what to plug into my projection to try to make it an accurate forecast, what I think was going to happen going forward.
One person online, Alvaro, who's going to speak, Krishna.
Okay, Krishna, go ahead.
Thank you. First, thanks very much for your insightful discussion. I wanted to return to the focus you put on the labour market in terms of interpreting the degree of restrictiveness in monetary policy. So I took from your comments that developments in the labour market, which certainly isn't booming, suggest that policy to date has been restrictive. If over an extended period of time looking forward, unemployment were to stabilize or even dip a little bit, but let's take the case in which it stabilizes, would you consider that as evidence that policy might in fact not be restrictive after all?
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to get at was what appears to me is there's a disconnect between the chatter that financial conditions are loose, growth is high, all this, the Fed can't be restrictive. And if all those things are consistent, you should see a labor market with the unemployment rate starting to fall, hiring rates picking up, quit rates going up. We're not seeing any of that. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between focusing on financial market loosing and what we're seeing in the real economy. And like I said, GDP growth has been high for a couple of reasons. One is a lot of immigration. You just put more labor to work, you're gonna get more output growth. Also, we've seen this, increase for about 5 quarters in productivity growth. That can lead to a booming economy, great financial conditions, doesn't mean anything about inflation going out of control or the labor market overheating in some sense. So that's all I was trying to get at, is I think there's a slight disconnect between everything people look at saying you're not restrictive, and if we're not restrictive, then it should be showing up in the labor market, and we're just not seeing that.
Thank you.
They just sent me another question online. Where do things stand on the work of your Fed committee is overseeing on lowering debit swipe fees in the United States?
Still working on it.
Okay. I think, is there any other question in the room? Well, we have quite a few questions already. And if not, then I would like to thank everyone, and particularly Governor Waller, for an enlightening session. These lectures of the governor is exactly to do what Governor Waller just did, which is basically talking about policy making and by policymakers, and what are they thinking about not only the present juncture, but also going forward. I think Governor Waller mentioned something that I think is quite important. Besides what we see in the day-to-day, the big trends that we see in terms of aging, in terms of digitalization, in terms of AI, in terms of also potentially climate, will have a significant impact not only in our own economies, but also for policy making, in particular for monetary policy making. So issues like aging, issues like productivity will have an impact and will increasingly be debated in the public sphere, but also having to be put in the equations that Governor Waller was mentioning that we have to factor out in terms of our policy-making decisions. And with that, I'm sure we're looking forward to what will happen, in particular what is happening with regards to productivity in the United States compared to other parts of the world. This is one of the things that certainly is diverging. The United States is diverging. And with that, I think it's a good way of getting away from this lecture. That policy making is very complex right now with a lot of volatility, but also significant long-term trends going forward that will affect our policies. So with that, I would like to thank Governor Waller, and let's give Governor Waller a big round of applause, and virtually and online and here too.
Thank you very much.